So without further ado, we would like to welcome Mr. Stephen Miller, the Eastern Regional Director of the U.S. Forest Service's Fire and Aviation Management Department, and our first speaker tonight. In addition to his position with the U.S. Forest Service, Mr. Miller serves on the Board of Directors for the International Association of Wildland Fire. In 2020 alone, Mr. Miller fought fires in both the American West and in Australia.
Mr. Miller is going to start off with a presentation, and he'll cover a variety of topics, including his own career fighting some of these fires and also the effects of the fires on ecosystems. And after that, we'll proceed with a question and answer session in which Andrew and I will ask Mr. Miller some questions we have compiled in addition to questions we receive in the chat or the Q&A from all of you. Mr. Miller, take it away.
All right. Thanks for the introduction. Let me get it queued up here so that I'm sharing my screen. All right. So yeah, my name's Steve Miller, and I serve the Eastern region of Forest Service. And so this is a map of that region. It's 20 states. And so they made it convenient for me. They started with all M's. So Minnesota down to Missouri, over to Maryland, up to Maine, and in between. A little bit about how I got to where I am. I grew up just outside of Minneapolis, St. Paul, a little town of Hudson, Wisconsin, and I went to school at Stevens Point, Wisconsin, which if you think of Wisconsin as a dartboard, Stevens Point is the bullseye. And they got a really good school for natural resources. And coincidentally, my wife and daughter are also Point graduates. And my daughter studied forestry as well. And so I like to say I've got a second generation forester and fire manager in the family. And after graduating from Stevens Point, I went to work with the Texas Forest Service. I'll show you a slide of that in just a minute. And that's where I really got introduced to fire. But right now, as regional director, we're working with 20 states, as I said, and then we've got 15 field units of national forests or national grasslands, and that covers about 12.5 million acres of the area in the 20 states. And we also have responsibility for working with the state partners, whether that's funding or providing equipment to them. We share equipment that we can get, retired military equipment and other things. And so there's about $200 million in equipment that's shared either to states or to volunteer fire departments. And they help us, we work as partners to achieve the fire job. But as I talked about, I began my fire career with the Texas Forest Service. After graduation, I went down there, worked there for 2 years. This is the first Texas Forest Service hand crew that was put together. We were on our way to a fire in the Kisatchie Wilderness area of Louisiana. And so they introduced me to fire, and I got a taste for it and had the opportunity to transfer from the Texas Forest Service to the Florida Forest Service. And then I spent 26 years working for the St. Johns River Water Management District, where I had the opportunity to help build the land management program. And I led that program for the last 20 years that I was there. And then in 2018, I retired from the state of Florida, having done 31 years total, and came up to Wisconsin, serving the U.S. Forest Service as the fire director. And so I want to give a little history of, that was the history of how I got to where I am, but let's talk a little bit of history about how the Forest Service got to where we are with that. So the Forest Service was born in 1905. It was dreamed up by Gifford Pinchot and Teddy Roosevelt, and they put it in place. And then, and it was trying to find its roots. And then it was subject to an event that occurred in 1910. It's called the Big Burn or the Big Blow Up. About 3 million acres of Western Washington, Idaho, and Montana burned in about 3 days. And it killed 78 firefighters across that area. And so there had previously been debates of how do we do fire. And that was one of those monumental events that decides the future. And so based on that impact of those 1910 fires, the Forest Service decided that the right answer was what they called the 10 a.m. policy, which is we should move enough resources that we think we can put out today's fire by 10 a.m. tomorrow. And then if you don't do it, you move more resources in to try and have it put out by 10 a.m. the next day. And so that had a significant change on the ecosystem, because this is, you could take this picture in the rolling hills of Georgia if you wanted to. You could take this picture in any place where we had Ponderosa. This is 1909, and the way it was kept open was by frequent fires that stayed on what we call the surface. And it fostered diverse understory vegetation, this open pine stand with very few branches, so fire couldn't climb up the trees. Well, we implement the 10 a.m. policy and the ecosystem begins to change. By 1948, you see a whole bunch of intermediate trees. This is the same spot, that's the same tree. And so you start to see intermediate trees that help change how fire is going to burn. Now, this is that same area in 1968, but they've come through and they've thinned out some of the trees. But again, lots of intermediate trees that will enable fire to climb up. This is the same area by 1989. A fire that's released in there or starts by lightning isn't going to behave the same way. So this is sort of how fire behaved way back when, you know, that pre-1909 picture kind of thing of what would happen typically. It would stay on the surface. It would occur depending on the part of the country. In the Southeast, it's every 3 years. In the West, it was about every 10 years. And it would invigorate the ground cover, so it was succulent, had lots of nutritional value for grazing, that kind of thing. But if we exclude it, because we put them all out and we allow those trees, the mid-story stuff, to accumulate, and now when fire gets going in there, it behaves like this, a significantly different situation than that, because the vegetation pattern has changed and we've allowed fuel to accumulate that used to get consumed on a regular basis. So, but that also, these are species I worked with in Florida. They are all threatened or endangered. And one of the reasons that they are threatened or endangered is we interrupted the fire cycle. This is a Bachman sparrow. It wants a fire cycle of every 2 years. These are gopher tortoises. They do well in a 2 or 3 year fire return interval. Here's burrowing owls, little owls about the size of a can of soda. They actually dig holes in the ground, thus their name, burrowing owls. They would like fire on an annual or up to 18-month basis. Flatwood salamander needs to be able to move back and forth between flatwoods, which have pine trees, and wetlands where they begin their life. And there needs to be no vegetation in between. Well, what maintains that? Fire maintains that. Bartram's ixia over here, an endangered plant named for William Bartram, one of the first explorers who took botanical notes down in the Southeast in the 1700s. And this plant, if you don't burn it, it doesn't flower. It waits until a fire comes out or some other disturbance. Sand skink, no, it's not a snake. It's got little tiny legs. Again, short fire return interval. Scrub jay, and I'm going to give its northern cousin here in a minute. It lives in scrub oaks that are burned about every 6 to 8 years, depending on how close it is to the coast. Sherman's fox squirrel, Audubon's caracara. Again, oh, and our favorite, red cockaded woodpeckers. They live in an area that is burned about every 2 years, and if it starts to grow up, their predators have the habitat is preferred by their predators rather than them. So now I've moved out of Florida and into Wisconsin, and here's that scrub jay's northern cousin. It's a Kirtland's warbler. It lives in jack pine, but it wants that same about 1.5 to 3 meter high vegetation to live in, and fire is what maintains that. And both sand pine and jack pine that this species lives in, so sand pine where the scrub jay is, jack pine where the Kirtland's warbler is, are have serotinous cones, meaning cones that stay closed until the fire heats them up, they open and release their seed and start the next generation. Connor's blue butterfly, again, depends on tall grass prairie that's maintained by fire. Eastern skippering. And then down here we have lupine, rusty bumblebee. And here it's actually the milkweed that's the listed species, but the monarch eats from it. And so all of these are maintained by fire in the area I work in now. And so when we went to that 10 a.m. policy, the vegetation continued to accumulate, sort of like you keep pouring gasoline into the engine a cup each year, so that then when the gas can is full, the fire would be bigger. Same kind of thing of that vegetation grows and changes how the fire is going to burn. And these species start to struggle because their habitat isn't being maintained. So accumulate all of that information about how often fire would have normally accumulated and normally occurred, and kept the fuel system moderated. And if you look at and you mapped all that, green means it's about at its normal situation. It's what they call condition class 1. Yellow is condition class 2, meaning it's starting to diverge from that situation. And condition class 3 is fire has been absent a long time and the vegetation pattern has changed dramatically. Now, the good news is you look at my old home state and we recognize that most of our listed species were dependent upon fire, and we were really committing energy toward it. You look at my new area and there are lots of reds. So we're actually trying to put fire back on the landscape to in a moderate format, not in that wild format that I showed you, to try and reinvigorate some of the species that were dependent upon that disturbance. Likewise in the West, lots of yellows and reds. And if you think about where the wildfires were focused this year, many of them are mapped as colors different from green. And I began my year, there was an interesting announcement. Apparently Time magazine included firefighters as the people of the year or the profession of the year. And if we look at this calendar year, this is actually me in Australia. Clay Stevens was working with me there. Australia faced a very difficult fire season. And remember, their summer is the opposite of ours. So they're going into their summer now. And so last November, they faced a multi-year drought and a fire season that was kicking it off. And we know we move resources around to help out. In fact, all the big air tankers, those airplanes that you see that drop the red stuff, fire retardant, spend their winters in Australia and their summers in the United States. Well, Australia recognized they were in trouble because they were in a multi-year drought. And so they called the United States and said, can you send us help? And they called Canada as well. And so we put together plane loads of people to go over and help out. I was part of the third wave that went over with 39 firefighters, and we ended up in Victoria. So now I can tell you I have fought and lit fires in both the northern and southern hemisphere. And to give you a concept of the scale of the fire outbreak, this is a heat signature from Australia, and you say, well, there's not a lot going on in here. That's because it's a desert, and so there really isn't anything to burn in there. But Australia, it looks little when you look on it on a globe, or you look at it in this image, but it's the same size as the continental United States. So what we refer to as the lower 48, it's the same size. And in a bad fire year in the United States, it's something between 7 and 8 million acres or more. We've had a year where it went up over 10 million acres. But Australia, last fire season, faced 24 million acres. So in an area that's the size of the lower 48, they had a fire season that was 3 or 4 times our bad fire seasons. And that's why they needed help. And they actually have this really cool model. So in Victoria, the CFA, or Country Fire Authority, is 38,000 people strong. But of those, 1,200 people are paid personnel. The rest of them are all volunteers. And when they go to volunteer on a fire assignment, they go for 5 days. And so we brought 39 firefighters over there, but we needed equipment and we needed some instruction in Australia fire behavior. So the people in the yellow suits that you see here are Australian firefighters who volunteered to be sort of our fire tour guide, look after us in that first 5-day period, give us their equipment, remind us about teaching on the driving on the opposite side of the road. You know, they drive on the left side of the road and you're driving from the right side of the vehicle, and your left turns are all easy and your right turns are hard, kind of thing. And so they really committed to helping us out, and we committed to help them out. And and when I was over there, they said, "Thank you so much for coming." And I said, "You need to understand something. You've sent personnel to help us in 2000 when I was in Montana, and in 2004 when we were in trouble over here, and in 2008. So all we're doing is repaying the favor." And it really is a reciprocity situation. This is me with Alan Slipjevic, who is also on the board of directors for the International Association of Wildland Fire. He was the president of the association at the time. I never thought I'd be standing next to him, working with him in Australia. And they taught us a lot about coming together and working together. In fact, those volunteers decided to commemorate our commitment. So this is our strike team 1198 and 1199 by striking what we call challenge coins. And they put together this message with the 2 flags, and it is "We work as one." And I wanna talk about how important that was. This year, the fire season in the United States was so extreme and required so many personnel. We gauged the severity of the fire season by the preparedness level. And preparedness level 1, everybody's happy. There aren't going to be any challenges. In preparedness level 2, we're going to start to have some tough decisions, and you might at a local level run out of resources. At preparedness level 3, we're starting to share resources across regions. Fires are starting to test our ability to stop them. By 4, we're having some extreme fire behavior where we might run short. At preparedness level 5, we are saying nationally, we don't have the personnel we need in order to do it. We start calling upon the military, the National Guard. And when I say we don't have it, I mean the states and the federal government working together with local fire departments are running out of resources. So we go to non-traditional sources like the military. They bring military aircraft with systems. We start bringing people in from Canada. We start bringing people in from Mexico. We had 30,000 firefighters on the line at certain points this year. We were at preparedness level 5 for 44 days straight. We were at preparedness level 5 in October. Neither of those things of 44 straight days or going into October had ever occurred before. Normally, we'll have fire seasons that sort of migrate. It starts in the southeast, then it's in the in the calendar year. Then it'll be in the northeast, and then the southwest, and then into the Great Plains and Great Basin, and then California and Oregon. The problem is we had all but 2 regions on fire at the same time. And we'd never been at that point before as well. And so the sharing of resources is essential, but sometimes you can still exhaust what we have available. And one of the things I learned, we talk about Smokey Bear, and prevention is a significant part of it. And our state partners work with us on fire prevention. Smokey Bear is a Forest Service motto that came up and was developed in World War II to help us reduce the wildfire risk because we had so many soldiers, sailors, and airmen overseas. The workforce here was low, so we really needed to make sure that we were preventing fires we could. And over time, as we learned, we went from only, Smokey can prevent forest fires to Smokey can prevent wildfires, because we recognize some of those fires that we put on the landscape as prescribed burns are needed. So the message was crafted. And similar to Smokey in the United States, Blaze the koala, and they don't say koala bear over there, it is just koala or koala, over in Australia. And so prevention is a significant part of it. And even with prevention, we work with our partners. Now, I talked about prescribed burning, and I talked about those species that are dependent upon fire. And so there are times when we literally have to paint landscapes with fire. Whether we do that to reduce wildfire risk by consuming the fuel or providing barriers of no fuel outside of protected areas, or we do it for ecological reasons for species, or we do it for some other ecosystem about purposes like regenerating certain pine trees. Either way, we're painting landscapes, and it takes a lot of science, but it also takes art. And I remember this pivotal moment when I was at Stevens Point, and they came in, they talked to us about silviculture. And the professor said, silviculture is the art and science of growing trees on the landscape. And so in my current job of being fire director, I have the responsibility of art and science of having fire on the landscape. There are some places and sometimes and in some intensities where fire is entirely appropriate. There are other times when weather is extreme, or the fuel load is too high, or there are urban or developed resources that we need to protect where fire is not appropriate on the landscape. And so it's that balance of art and science, and I consider art to be sort of the experience of doing it, using the science building blocks that we have learned about fire behavior and fire weather and all of those kinds of tools that we use. And in fire, there's what we call the fire triangle. And so the way that we're manipulating fire on that landscape, on the fire triangle, we have the fuel leg, we have the heat leg, and the oxygen or air leg. And all three of those are needed in order for fire to exist on the landscape. Typically, what we do is we manipulate this fuel leg. And so what they did is they went out here and dug little lines where the fuel has now been separated by the little fire line, and they light the fire off of it. So it's small, doesn't have a lot of energy, and it's like building a fence. That fire line is now a fence, and just like we would keep livestock inside a fenced area, we can keep fire in with the fence. And the size of the fence is determined by the flame length that's going to be over here. And so when you get one of those really big fires with really big flame lengths, you need a really big fence. If they're just lighting off of it, a little fence, even maybe just this wide, will be enough to stop it. And so we use those tools we know, have learned from about fire in the science side to manage it on the landscape. And so that's sort of the introduction, and I'm ready for Alex and Andrew to ask me their questions, which we've sort of queued up for.
All right, sounds good, Mr. Miller. Thank you for that. Andrew, I think you had...
Yeah, so I think our first question for you, Mr. Miller, is would you mind telling us one crazy story from your experiences fighting the fires?
Sure. So let's talk about my first fire.
Okay.
I was early on, and I didn't have a whole lot of experience with it. And I managed to read the map and get to the fire first. And this is in Texas, and the guys who were teaching me about fire, most of them had fought in World War II. So, after fighting in World War II, a little grass fire in Texas doesn't really get them all excited. But since it was my first fire, I was way excited. So I get there and I bail out of call in on the radio, and I bail out of the truck and grab my shovel, and I'm throwing dirt and all of this kind of thing. Lots of energy, not very efficient. And so the guys who knew what they were doing pull up with the bulldozer. They watch me for a minute, and they said, and in Texas, they talk a little bit slower than I do. They said, "Son, if you just sit down here underneath this shade tree, we'll show you how this is done." And they unloaded the bulldozer and they scratched the little line around it, and it was way more efficient, way more effective than me out there going willy-nilly with my shovel. And so that goes back to the wisdom somebody said, you probably can't always outrun a fire, so you better outsmart it. And so those fellows took the time and invested in me and gave me some of the tools that helped me outsmart it instead of outrun it.
That's great, Mr. Miller. We have a question in the chat that says, how close of a scare have you gotten, or the most dangerous situation you've been in terms of a fire?
So the scariest situation we had, we went down to Australia, and we were originally dispatched to Queensland, which is in northeastern Australia, but they got a little rain and the weather got worse in Victoria. So they moved us from Queensland to Victoria, and they gave us a day of training about this is how the equipment works. And here in the United States, we carry fire shelters. Imagine an aluminum foil pup tent, and you carry it with you. And if things, now you're supposed to outthink it. You're supposed to not get in that position. But sort of like if you're a pilot and the airplane's coming apart, you use a parachute. If we get in that situation, we pull out this little aluminum foil pup tent, we lie down on the ground, and we're supposed to let the fire go over us. In Australia, they don't do that. They get you into the fire truck, and they have a sprinkler system on the outside, and they have the same kind of aluminum foil curtains that they roll down. So they teach us that to get in the truck, turn on the sprinklers, and roll down the curtains. Well, they taught us all that on one day, and the next day they were sending us out as what they called a spike day. It's what I'd call a PL5 red flag day. And as we were going out there, we have a radio transponder that will tell them where we are. And every expectation was that this fire that was coming that we could see for about 70 miles, they were gonna see us on the dispatch screen, and they were gonna send us into it. And the problem, Australia has two fuel types, grass and eucalyptus. And the eucalyptus is so flammable and pieces of bark will come off that spots. Fires can start by embers going up into the smoke column and coming down somewhere else 24 miles away based on how extreme the weather was. That's what we were told we were going into. And so that's about as scared as I've been. The fortunate thing is they recognized that fire was still running too hard and we needed to wait for it to come out into the grass. And by the time it did that, it was, we had a little bit of change in humidity and a whole lot better day the next day.
That's great. I think we're going to continue with some questions in the chat here. We have some interesting questions coming in from the chat. First, what are some of the things that we as everyday American citizens can do to reduce fire risk?
In the Southeast, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, to some extent parts of North Carolina, the general public has come to understand that when we're prescribed burning, yeah, we're helping the ecosystem, but we're also reducing the risk of wildfire. Now, the smoke, we still put up smoke. It's a whole lot less in volume, less in concentration because we're burning it differently. But there's some people who find that smoke to be a nuisance. And so they call somebody and complain about the smoke. Well, the best thing people down there, or frankly, if we're prescribed burning, the best thing anybody else can do is understand that a little bit of smoke on a day when we picked the wind direction and we picked the wind speed and we picked the relative humidity, so we've done our best to make it as small a smoke as we can, putting up with that little bit of smoke actually helps us not have big bad smoke that might be going the wrong way, blowing towards a highway or a hospital or an airport. And you know, you all are pretty close to the New Jersey Pine Barrens. And so prescribed fire is a key, a key tool towards maintaining the Pine Barrens as Pine Barrens and towards reducing the wildfire risk. So the best thing you can do is realize that when the New Jersey State Forestry Agency is burning in the Pine Barrens, putting up with a little bit of smoke and not complaining about it and understanding that it's playing a key role is probably the best thing you can do to help.
That's great.
Mr. Miller, I've got one more question for you before we get to more questions from the chat. So could you describe it? You talked about the PL5 this year, but could you describe in how the fires have evolved over time and some of the technology changes, as well as some of the fire behavior changes?
Yeah, so I've alluded a little bit to the fire behavior change. I want you to imagine it. If it's an area that's supposed to burn every 3 years. So during that 3 years, we're pouring gasoline into it. There's no evaporation of the gasoline. And so every time we miss one of those fires, there's just a little more gasoline in the can. When that can now lights on fire, it's 10 of these full of gasoline in it instead of only one of those of gasoline in it. So that's how things have morphed into changing. One of the ways things have changed in fire behavior. The other thing is, I talked about the importance of having different regions on fire. We do not have enough personnel to be on fire everywhere at once. We share airplanes with Australia. So as the climate is morphing, and in the old days, the airplanes, there wasn't a conflict between Australia and the United States because the retardant bombers would be up here from about May through about September. And then they'd move to Australia in November, and they'd be done there in March and come back. Well, now the fires are burning in the shoulder seasons. So there are times when we're having fires here and don't have the air tankers because Australia still needs them. Or in the fall, Australia can't get them because we still need them. Just for this year, and understand the workforce is also having to put up with not more stress and with longer seasons. And so the personnel I went to Australia with started their fire season on New Year's in January. And my wife just got back from a fire, and we just closed out the last summer fire with 100% containment last week. That was in Colorado, the Cameron Peak. It's absolutely unheard of that you have fires in Colorado after about July, because normally the monsoon rain season comes into Colorado and fire is no longer a risk by late season. So the fact that it went into December, again, unheard of. So those are the changes. They're burning more extreme. The season is longer. There's sometimes more of them. This year, it wasn't so much about the number as it was about the number of big ones. 10 years ago, a big fire was 100,000 acres. This year, we had one go over 1 million acres in California.
Wow. So one more question from the chat real quick, Mr. Miller. So you were talking a lot about prescribed burning and the effects it has on the environment. After you prescribe burn or after there's a wildfire, does the environment return to a state of normalcy? Or do big wildfires hurt the environment more? So
I want to use an example from Florida. There was a rare community called the Sandhill, and it was right outside of, it's in the city of Jacksonville. Jacksonville has 1 million people, and the boundary was right up against a whole bunch of condominiums. And so we were restoring that area to the Sandhill, and so we were intentionally burning it on a short cycle of every other year. And all kinds of plant species started to respond. Species that people hadn't seen in a long time. Bartram's ixia was back. Wiregrass was becoming prolific. Longleaf was doing well. Sherman's fox squirrels were more abundant. We were seeing it. And we were burning it often enough that the neighbors understood what we were doing. And they got used to, in Florida, green up starts within days after a fire. And so they were used to, first you see the lovely little green wiregrass and oh, aren't they cute? And then you start to see the purple flowers, the Bartram's ixia, the liatris. Then you see the yellow flowers. And so they began to think of it as a movie. So we actually had some neighbors complain that we were burning their neighbors, the piece in front of their neighbors more often than we were burning theirs, and they were missing watching their movie. So when we keep it on that short cycle, the ecology works really well and things recover. Now we're going to go to, I saw an article in the paper today that somebody sent me, giant sequoias. They're a fire-dependent species, but they're dependent upon a relatively frequent fire. In their case, it's about 20 or 30, every 20 or 30 years. And there are giant sequoias, lots of them, that burned this year. And because we didn't burn it frequently, all that fuel accumulated, and what can happen is that fire can smolder, and root systems and bark that are used to insulating themselves against a fire that might go for 5 hours are now exposed to a fire that goes for 30 days because it's dry and it's continuing to smolder. So potentially trees that are 1,000 years old and are fire dependent are being killed by fire because the nature of the fire is different.
So on that note, just got a question in the chat, and I'm not sure if this is totally your expertise because it's about the West, but are you able to speak to the damage to the giant redwoods a little bit in California as a result of the latest wildfires?
Yeah, sequoias and redwoods are cousins, and
Okay.
so that's what they're subjected to. They have thick bark, and they have the ability to sprout. And so when they're little, they sprout. And when they're big, the thick bark protects them from the heat of a wildfire. But the way the thick bark works is it's an insulator. And so there's an amount of time that insulation works well. If the heat keeps coming and keeps coming, the insulation eventually is slowing the heating process. It's not preventing it entirely. And once you get the cambium layer inside that bark to 140 degrees, it dies. And the cambium is where the xylem and phloem come from that keep that tree growing and alive. And so it's hard for people to understand that a species can be fire dependent and be killed by fire.
Yeah.
Well, it's because the fire that would have been there wouldn't have been able to have enough heat to get through the insulation. Now with accumulated material and with drought, it overheats the insulation.
Wow. That's great. Now, more along the lines of like fighting the fires themselves. When you get to a fire, and I know you were telling us a little bit about that in our previous meetings. When you get to a fire, what are the things that firefighters do to get these massive fires under control?
So little fires are what we call initial attack. And so that's a fire just started by a lightning strike. And so we might be able to catch it with a couple of people with hand tools, or we catch it with a fire engine and we spray water and we go around it. All that's cool because the flames are small, the fire line can be small. But if we go back to remembering that I got to break that fuel leg of the triangle, and my break in the fuel leg has to be between 1.5 and 2.5 times the flame length, the bigger the fire gets, the bigger my fire line has to get. And in some cases, if you think about that picture I showed you where the fire was going through the tops of the trees in South Dakota, the flame lengths were 200 feet tall. So if I go to my 1.5, I'm going to just do simple math, my 1.5 times that flame length, now I got to have a fire line that's 300 feet wide in order to stop it. So the kinds of things that when you get to that big, what we'll do is get far enough out in front, we'll do the math, we'll have people with geographic information systems and computers and air photos and satellites and all those kinds of things. They will tell us how fast they think the fire is going to move, and then we'll get out in front of it far enough that we can build a fire line, and then we'll actually use fire to widen our fence. So if we build a 20-foot wide fence, we can hold in a fire that will light off of it. And then that fire will continue to burn and chew up towards the wildfire until I've got that 300 feet of fence that I need to stop that big wildfire. And one of the things you asked me earlier, what are the things that changed? Okay, so in the old days, originally you went out there with a bunch of people, sometimes with wet gunny sacks, and you'd smack it and that would knock it down. Sometimes with shovels. Well, then one of the guys in that 1910 fire, his name was Ed Pulaski, and he developed the fire tool we call the Pulaski, and it's for digging line or cutting down brush. So that's what you used, was people and hand tools. Well, then after World War II, a whole bunch of trucks and things became available, and so they started tinkering with them and putting water tanks in army jeeps and getting little bulldozers. And so the technology started to advance and the tools became more numerous. Nowadays, we've got people studying right now to use drone aircraft that are solar powered that'll stay up for 30 days. They'll essentially go up to the edge of the atmosphere and they'll stay up there for 30 days. and they'll send us back pictures of the fires, so we know where they are, we know how big they are. It'll serve as a platform for us to use radio repeaters so that we have improved communication. I used to, when I first went to forestry school, the way I determined acreage on the ground was I would walk and I knew how many feet were in each of my steps with a compass, and that's how I'd calculate acreage. Well, now I can do a GPS unit on my phone and it tells me the same thing, and my phone tells me what the weather's going to be and all kinds of stuff. So we are reliant upon technology, but it also reduces the number of people we need to have. So if we're short people at 30,000 with 30,000 firefighters and all the technology, imagine where we'd be if we were still all hand tools.
Yeah, wow. That's crazy to think about. And I think that brings us into probably our last big question for tonight. When you were telling us about 21-day shifts when we met the other day, what's it like to go out there to the fires? How many hours a day do you work? Where do you sleep? Like, what are the conditions like at the fire when you go there?
So the normal fire assignment, you have daily fires, those in our normal work units here. And, those are, you go there from when it starts, and typically in 3 or 4 hours, you got it wrapped up and you go home. But the big fire assignments, when a fire exceeds the ability of local resources to control, that's going to be typically a 14-day assignment. So you leave home, you pack all the things you're going to need, and it's about 75 to 100 pounds of gear, depending on what you do on the fire. Because realize we need people running computers that are doing our situation report. You got people who are doing the logistics of buying all the food, water, and catering and everything. And then there's those of us that are out on the ground kind of thing. So you go out with your 100 pounds of gear, you get out there, and typically you're in a tent. And we will build a city to support the firefighters. It'll typically be at the fairgrounds. So you're living where, livestock has been dusty, all of those kinds of things. And we'll bring in the stuff we need to build our city. A catering truck will come in. It'll be a semi. They'll have a kitchen in this semi. They open the doors and you build a line for a cafeteria. You'll have another one that'll come in and open the doors, and it's a complete computerized system. Another one that opens the doors and it becomes a shower unit. And so we have to provide for those firefighters all of the stuff they need to get through a day. And when I say a city, I've been on fires in Montana where we were the biggest city in the county during the fire.
Wow.
And then you got to build an air base. Typically, we'll take over a small municipal airport for all of that. It's a lot of folks, not just the people on the end of the nozzle, to make this all happen. My wife works in finance. She manages payroll and contracts for paying contractors. My daughter's the public information officer. So she's taking news reporters out to the fire line. She's line qualified, so she makes sure they're safe and helps tell the story so that all the folks back home know what's going on.
Okay, one last question for you, Mr. Miller. We had an interesting one, nuanced one from Mr. Willis of Mercersburg. So, does the government work with insurance companies to come up with a strategy to work with homeowners and private property and reintroduce fires to some places where there are homes?
So yes, absolutely. Have we got it all dialed in? Some parts of the country have it really well dialed in. Florida, Georgia are some of the leaders there. California, they're working with the insurance company, and most recently, they've worked with the utility companies. After the fire that went into Paradise, that was a power line that blew down in a windstorm, the power companies have now hired fire personnel. And so they have engines that will protect their infrastructure. They have people who are going out and maintaining the fuels in advance. And they have a system where they turn off the power in advance of major windstorms. Is that inconvenient because your TV doesn't work? Yeah, but if it has the potential to not cause a 70,000 acre wildfire, the inconvenience of not having your TV work might be worth it. So yes, we have a thing called the cohesive strategy. And that's where everybody comes together and sort of takes their piece of it.
That's great, Mr. Miller. And think just on behalf of everyone, we'd like to thank you for your presentation and for sharing your stories, experiences, and knowledge with all of us. I know some of us here are from California and were directly affected by some of these fires, and I know a lot of us have been hearing about them on the news all year. I know I have. So everyone, if we could give a virtual round of applause to Mr. Miller, that'd be great. And Mr. Miller, thank you for everything. You are good to go.
All right. Thank you both for the opportunity and for the work you put into making this happen.
Thank you so much,
No
Mr.
problem.
Miller.
And our next speaker for tonight, everyone, is Miss Julie Tierney. Miss Tierney is a Ph.D. candidate at Princeton University and will be sharing her research with us tonight. Miss Tierney's work is focused on fire ecology and fire-dependent ecosystems, which ties directly to many of the points Mr. Miller was discussing in his presentation. She'll also be discussing the effects of climate change on the wildfires. So Ms. Tierney, feel free to start your presentation.
Hi, can you see the screen I'm sharing? Let me start the slideshow.
Yep, where you can see it, we're all good.
Can you see the slideshow?
Yep, no
okay.
problem.
All right, great. Anyway, thank you for the introduction. And again, thank you for organizing this. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking to you today. I'm going to touch on some things that Mr. Miller touched on about fire ecology and the importance of fire. But again, I'm going to bring in some of my own work and talk more about climate change. And also we're going to go to the Amazon for some of this as well. So let me introduce myself first. So I just want to say, first of all, that I'm so happy to be talking with you all tonight because in high school, I was in a similar group as this. I was in an environmental activist and sustainability club in high school, which really got me interested in environmental topics. And I knew from that experience that I wanted my career somehow to be tied into understanding climate change. So from there, I went to college. I'm from North Carolina, and I went to a small liberal arts school in North Carolina where I studied environmental studies, and I continued there with my environmental activism work. But there I really discovered that what my role in this is biology and ecology. I just loved science and I loved understanding ecosystems. I loved studying plants, and really I loved doing field work. I loved getting my boots dirty and going and doing field research. So in college, I did all of the research that I could and continued my research when I got my master's of science in ecology at the University of Georgia, where I first started studying fire ecology and was introduced to one of the ecosystems that Mr. Miller was talking about in Florida, longleaf pine savannas. And I loved that so much that I went on to go study for my PhD at Princeton University, where I'm at right now in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. And I've shifted my focus somewhat to study in the Amazon basin. And what broadly the question that I want to answer is what limits tree growth and carbon storage in the Amazon? So what am I going to talk about? So first I'm going to, so again, Mr. Miller gave you, I'm sure all of you now have a really good appreciation for fire's importance to Earth's ecosystems, but I'm also going to give my perspective on that. And I'm going to share you what I learned from studying longleaf pine savannas in my master's. And then we're going to talk more about how climate change has been interacting with wildfires. And finally, talk about climate change and fire in the Amazon. So where we're going to start out is 450 million years ago in the Silurian era. And we're starting out here because this 450 million years ago is when plants first colonized land. And truly, we cannot understand Earth's ecosystems. We can't understand plants without understanding fire, because along with land plants 450 million years ago, this is when Earth started experiencing its first wildfires. So as long as there were plants on Earth, it was burning. So the ecosystems on our planet have evolved with and are adapted to fire. There are many really interesting examples of ecosystems and plants that are adapted to frequent fire, a lot of what you've learned about in the past hour. So here what I'm showing you is a longleaf pine savanna, which is dependent on fire return intervals, so frequency of fire of from 2 to 4 years to maintain this open canopy structure and a really biodiverse understory. And some plants need fire to reproduce. So a lot of pine species need fire to release the seeds in their cones. The seeds of some plants need smoke to germinate or need the heat of fire to germinate. And fire can be seen then as really a regenerative process. So now I'm going to tell you a story that illustrates some ecosystem magic with fire. So how these ecosystems have truly adapted and utilized fire to maintain their function. So although fire maintains the structure of these systems, and a lot of species in these systems need it to survive and complete their life cycle, fire also removes a lot of nitrogen in the ecosystem. Now this is a problem because you might be familiar with nitrogen if you garden, if your family has a garden, or if you have a lawn that needs fertilizer, because a lot of plants, especially in the part of the world that we live in, need nitrogen to grow. In fact, nitrogen is what limits their growth. So fire comes in and it removes nitrogen that plants need to grow back after fire. So how do these ecosystems deal with this? Well, nitrogen is also the most abundant gas in the atmosphere, and it's dinitrogen gas form. But unfortunately, in this form, it's not available to plants. It's the most abundant gas, but plants can't use it. So it has to get first converted into a form that plants can use, into ammonia. And this can happen through a number of processes. Lightning does this, but it can also happen biologically. There are specialized bacteria that can fix atmospheric nitrogen into its plant available form. And there are also some species of plants that form these relationships with nitrogen fixing bacteria in the bean family, in the legumes. So soybeans do this, and plants related to beans do this. So here, what I'm holding are roots of a legume plant in longleaf pine forest, and these little, maybe you can see these little spheres on them, those are root nodules. So the plant has built these nodules, these like houses for nitrogen fixing bacteria. The plants give them carbon, the food that the plants create from photosynthesis, and in return the bacteria provide nitrogen for these plants to regrow after fire. But the one problem with this is that this process requires a lot of another nutrient, not nitrogen, but phosphorus. But fire makes phosphorus more available in the environment because phosphorus becomes liberated from other materials with high temperature fires and becomes available for this process. And in return, the plants give nitrogen back to the system. So I just wanted to tell you this story as one way that you can appreciate some of the really intricate ways that ecosystems have evolved and are adapted to fire. And there are so many different examples of these amazing fire-adapted ecosystems, African savannas, prairie ecosystems, the chaparral shrublands in California, and our own pine barrens in New Jersey. But although these systems are adapted to fire, they're mostly adapted to low intensity natural fires, and extremely hot fires can be devastating even to fire adapted plants. So one example of this, in the chaparral shrubland ecosystems, these shrubs can resprout after fire because a lot of their plant biomass is below ground. They have these vast root systems. So when their tops burn off, they have enough stored underground that they can resprout. But a really, really hot fire and a really large fire, like the ones that we've been seeing more and more often, can burn up those roots. And so this system doesn't regenerate. And when vast areas of forest burn, we can no longer count on them to come back. So now we're going to talk more about how climate change is interacting with weather conditions to create the perfect conditions for these devastating fires that we are seeing. So first, we're just going to review a little bit, and this might be something that you've seen before. So this is a graph that shows in blue, over time, the rising concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution due to the combustion of fossil fuels. And you see in red the temperature anomaly. And anomaly just means how different it is from the average. So a positive anomaly means that it's higher than average. So the temperature anomaly rises and tracks quite consistently rising atmospheric carbon dioxide. And there is a direct causal relationship between carbon dioxide concentration and rising temperatures. So this increase in carbon dioxide is causing the rise in temperatures that is causing climate change. Not only are we seeing an increase in temperatures as a result of climate change, but we're also seeing a change in precipitation regimes globally. So really, a lot of what we're seeing is increasing drought frequency and severity. So this is showing a projection from 2030 to 2039 of what we're likely to see with precipitation regimes. And the darker colors here, the reds and the purples, are where things are going to get a lot drier. And you do see that there are some areas that are going to get wetter, but let's focus here just for my presentation on the West Coast here, gonna get a lot drier, and also on the Amazon. So this is from 2030 to 2039. And then if we fast forward even further in our predictions, you see it's going to get a lot more extreme. So those fires that Mr. Miller and his colleagues so bravely fought earlier in 2020 were made more likely because of the conditions caused by climate change. So how and why does this happen? So again, let's review of what causes wildfires. Well, you need the right weather conditions, you need to be hot and dry, you need lots of burnable fuel, and of course you need a spark. And what's happening is climate change has really stacked the deck in favor of bigger and more intense fires in many parts of the world, like Australia and like the American West. And increasing heat, changing rain and snow patterns, and shifts in plant communities, which are all symptoms of climate change, are all contributing to this. So specifically with higher temperatures, hotter air can act like a sponge for moisture. The hotter the air is, exponentially can absorb more moisture from the air. And so we're also seeing longer and more severe droughts. So this is making lots of really, really dry burnable fuel for these fires. And again, what we learned from Mr. Miller's presentation is that there's been a history of fire suppression in forest management, which has led to a buildup of lots of burnable fuel. So we also talked about the wildfire season in the West this year. So 2020 was the biggest fire season in California in recorded history. So why did this happen? What happened? Well, lots of interacting effects, and a lot of them have to do with climate change. So this winter, it was a shorter winter. The snow melted earlier, And the snow cover in March was well below its long-term average. And then there was an extremely hot summer. The heat kicked in and it stayed in. And many Western states this year had the hottest summer on record. And all of this interacted with the persistent drought that the West has had since 2011. So in the past 9 years, this persistent drought has caused a massive die-off of trees. So then you have a huge buildup of burnable fuel that became very, very dry, and even more dry with the extreme heat and the mild winter this year. So really all it needed was a spark, which humans are more than capable of doing. And one huge devastating fire this year in California was caused by a pyrotechnic display, if you remember in the news, from a gender reveal party. So although climate change isn't the single causal factor of these wildfires, it's certainly making things worse. So let's also talk about the fire-dependent system, the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. And I don't know if you've ever been here, but it's really such a gorgeous and unique environment. It's populated with pitch pines, and pitch pines are one of these species of pines that need fire in order to release their seed cones. So another thing so there's many different interacting effects of climate change that may increase fire risk, devastating fire risk in the Pine Barrens. And one of those is the southern pine beetle. So the southern pine beetle is moving its range up north because of shorter winters caused by climate change. So now, due to these more mild winters, the Pine Barrens and other pine forests in New Jersey and New York and Connecticut are dying off from this beetle that is really, really good at killing trees. It gets under the bark and it eats the phloem, which is where trees store their sugar in their food. So because of the increased range of the pine beetle, there's lots of buildup of dead pine trees. And now this is another fuel source which can interact with the more arid and conditions and higher temperatures induced by climate change. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Amazon rainforest. And it was big in the news last year about the Amazon burning. Actually, I work in the rural Peruvian Amazon now for my PhD, and I was in, I think I was on a 3-week trip down the river where I didn't have cell phone service, and I came out and I had all these messages from my family and friends like, oh, are you okay? I hear the Amazon is burning. Are you seeing smoke? Did you get caught in a fire? Well, the Amazon's a really big place. I was not in any risk. I had no idea what was going on, actually. But a lot of the Amazon is burning, and we're going to talk about why. But the Amazon is really, really important. It's a global resource of biodiversity. It covers 7% of the Earth's land surface, but contains over 50% of the world's wildlife. But it's also important for another big reason, is that it's a huge carbon sink. So a carbon sink is something that stores carbon as opposed to a source which releases carbon. So trees when they photosynthesize, they take CO2 out of the atmosphere and incorporate it into their tissue as carbon. So because the Amazon is so big, it really is a global asset in buffering against climate change. In fact, the Amazon basin is responsible for 25% of all of the carbon dioxide taken out of the air by plants every year. And this year alone, 5.4 million acres burned in the Brazilian Amazon, which is about the size of the country of Wales. And this is a picture that I took when I was in the rural Peruvian Amazon. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how these fires are started. So this is a picture that I took when I was staying with a family, and they had a pineapple farm. And they burned down some of their land in order to plant their pineapples. And this is a traditional way of doing agriculture in that region. And on small scales, it's not harmful and can fertilize the soil. However, these fires are now burning hotter and they're burning bigger because the Amazon is getting drier and it's getting hotter. So now these fires have the potential to get out of control, and that's what has happened last year and this year in the Brazilian Amazon. And what this makes, and it gets really complicated because these forests can't really regenerate after fire. What's really interesting about the Amazon is that it supports some of the highest levels of plant growth and some of the highest levels of biomass of plants in the world, yet they grow on extremely nutrient-poor soil. So the plants there have adapted to grow a very, very intricate system of growing on this soil. And when fires come in and tear them down, it's extremely hard, if not impossible, for the forest to establish again. So with climate change, scientists have actually projected that much of the Amazon can actually turn from forest into a savanna. So a savanna is a very, very low biomass system. So biomass is the mass of the biological mass. I can't explain that any other way, I guess. The mass of a plant. So what happens is, so savannas are fire-adapted systems. They're dry fire-adapted systems. So when the Amazon is getting hotter and drier and fire comes in, it can possibly turn into a savanna. And so over the next 50 years, we may see a lot of the Amazon turn into savannas. And not only does fire, when it burns plants, release that stored carbon back into the atmosphere, but the less biomass system of a savanna stores less carbon. So we have the potential to lose that huge asset of carbon storage in the Amazon. So what does this mean for our future? And what does the new normal mean? This is what a lot of people say about these extreme events, about these extreme wildfires, that this is our new normal. So what does this mean, and what can we expect in the future? So small changes in the averages of many key climate variables can correspond to large changes in weather. Oh, I'm so sorry. Go back here. So weather on our planet can be described in a rough bell-shaped curve. So right here is where the average is. This is the area of the highest probability, is the average. So the climate increase in the average shifts the odds for extreme weather events to occur, such as wildfires. So when we shift the average, the area of probability for extreme weather events becomes larger. So there's more probability of events that used to be extreme happening. And actually, now we are exposed to never before seen or experienced weather events because this average is shifting. So although you read that the current global average temperature rise has been 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, and that doesn't seem like a lot, this is a big deal because it increases the probability for these extreme weather events, such as wildfire. So what can we do about this? The solution is to stop burning fossil fuels. These devastating wildfires are becoming more frequent because of climate change, and climate change is caused by increasing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And the solution to this is not plastic straw. It's not stopping to use plastic straws. It's stopping to burn fossil fuels, and a lot of people in power do not like this solution, but it really is the only way forward. So that is my message to you, and thank you so much. Please ask any questions about my career trajectory, about the presentation, about my research. Really, we can talk about anything.
Thank you so much, Ms. Tierney, for that presentation. Thank you so much. So we can take questions in the chat. I know I've got quite a few questions. One, when we were talking with you yesterday, Ms. Tierney, you mentioned what had happened with your research due to COVID. That was an interesting story. You want to relay that to the participants?
Oh, yeah, sure. So in March, I was in the Amazon. I had gotten there in late January before the COVID situation. We really understood the COVID situation before it had even reached South America. I was in one of the most remote parts of Peru in the Amazon when the president there closed the borders and declared a state of national emergency and was not supporting foreigners returning home. So the United States government had to send an evacuation flight to the middle of the Amazon to retrieve United States citizens. So my research trip was cut short after a couple of tense weeks.
That's a cool story. I have some questions, and you mentioned like your career path and things like that. What careers are available for in the field of like environmental research, specifically regarding what you've done in terms of fires and ecosystems?
Yeah, so there's lots. So when I first got my master's, I didn't know if I wanted to have a research career, and I wanted to have a job somewhere like what Mr. Miller has. I wanted to work in management. But also you can work as a research technician if you want to do research. So there are lots of labs doing fire ecology research and doing climate change research that you can become a technician for, and you can do that right out of college, or you can do that with a master's degree to get more of a leadership position in that field. You could also work for nonprofits like the Nature Conservancy. But my career trajectory now is I want to continue with research, and I want to do my own, be in charge of my own research and have my own lab. So that's why I'm getting it.
That's great. And along those lines, how does one go about getting into environmental research in the first place, picking a niche like yours is in this fire ecology topic? So can you just give us some insight into that process?
Yeah, really, it's just follow whatever excites you, because you won't be happy doing something that doesn't excite you, because you have to really be so committed to your topic. So I think in college, I knew I wanted to study something about plants, because I think in my intro biology class, I looked at plant cells under a microscope, and it was just like the most beautiful thing that I've ever seen. And I remember learning in college about the process of nitrogen fixation that I discussed with you, how plants and bacteria can convert can make their own nitrogen. I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. So I was like, I have to know more about that. So just follow what interests you.
Yeah. So we've got a question coming in the chat. So besides traveling to the Amazon, in your opinion, what are some other places around the world that are these big carbon sinks like you were talking about that would be ideal to continue your research?
Yeah, so really tropical forests are big carbon sinks, so other Asian forests, but really a huge carbon sink is the Arctic. So much of the world's carbon on land is stored in soils in the Arctic, in the permafrost, because decomposition there is really, really slow. So plant material just sticks, which stores a lot of carbon, just sticks around there. And if you're interested in climate change, this is a huge area of research with climate change, is because with warming temperatures, which are warming even faster in the Arctic than they are globally, that permafrost is melting, causing decomposition, and that carbon is being released into the atmosphere. So it's also a huge area of research that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
I've got one last question for you, I think, before or actually there's one coming in.
Yeah, let's have this be the last question, Andrew. And this is kind of a more current one. How have you adapted your research on this topic with COVID restrictions, especially given the fact that you were down in the Amazon for a while?
Yeah, so if you're going to do research anywhere, especially in a different country, you need to make sure that you have lots of good friends and collaborators in that part of the world with you who are invested in the project. And I am lucky to have those people there. So actually, when they announced the restrictions, the state of emergency, it was really dangerous for foreigners to be outside, but my team is local. And so they were like, okay, we're just gonna go. So they spent the national emergency in the woods doing the project when I was evacuated. And they're doing such a great job with some experiments that we set up. Some of it has been lost, but a lot of it is, they're doing a great job, and I hope to get back as soon as possible.
Cool. One last question for you. How has was being in like one of these high school sustainability clubs, I know this is relevant for a lot of our participants, like prepared you for a career in environmental activism and environmental research?
I think this just gets down to following something that really drives you. And I remember being, I think, a senior in high school when I really started to internalize and understand what climate change meant for my planet, and to feel that sense of personal responsibility for my planet and for generations that will come after me. And so this really put a drive in me that helps me do all the hard things that I had to do. Like, grad school is hard. It's not easy, but I have to remember, I actually have to go back sometimes for my own motivation to the club like this that I was in, where I really felt that motivation to remember why I'm doing it.
All right, thank you so much, Ms. Tierney, for sharing your research with us and for giving us some really cool insights about fire-dependent ecosystems and fire in the Amazon.